If I were doubling down as a law student now, I would be looking at the human skills, building out my negotiation, empathy, listening, design, creative skills, team skills, and my business knowledge, finance, valuation, accounting, strategy, business skills. So I understand what the client is actually trying to achieve at a better level than AI would. And I can be integrating that and prompt engineering and understanding how to work with tech and building out use cases, studying all of them. That's where value is going to be added.
I'm Hal Marcus.
And I'm Meme Woodiway.
And this is Meeting of the Minds, the legal AI podcast from Evisort.
We interview lawyers, professors, and legal operations pioneers that are pushing the envelope.
Leaders using technology to drive great business outcomes and shape the future of the profession. Meme, I'm slightly intimidated for this next interview, and that doesn't happen to me too easily at this point in my career, but I'm the only non-Harvard Law School guy in this conversation.
No, that's totally fine. You're used to that.
Oh, it's okay with you? Okay, good to know.
You're used to that working at Evisort, I'm sure. And I mean...
You know what they say about Harvard Law School? It's the University of Michigan Law School of the East.
Well, as an Ohioan and a Harvard Law School alumni, I take great offense to every part of that.
My work is done. Let's talk about Professor Scott Westfahl.
Well, I mean, Professor Scott Westfahl was actually back when we first had the idea for Evisort and started this out of the Harvard Innovation Lab. He was one of the few professors that Jake, Jerry, Riley, and I were able to take this idea to and actually really take it seriously and see the vision that we had for AI and contracting far before it was as en vogue as it is today. And so it's really cool to get to talk to him again. And he has such a unique perspective as a lawyer who has worked in consulting and worked in so many other domains where non-traditional legal skills like empathy and task management so well emphasized. I'm excited.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed talking to him in the past. We had the pleasure of doing a webinar with him last year. And now with the aspect of generative AI kind of turning this industry on its head, there was a lot to talk to him about. So yeah, I'm real excited to share this one.
Excellent. Well, yeah, without further ado, let's dive into our conversation with Professor Scott Westfahl.
Professor Scott Westfahl, thank you so much for joining us.
It's great to be with you, Hal. Me too.
Would love to kick off just with you telling us a little bit about some of the exciting things that you teach and some of the course areas that you've been able to touch upon in your teachings, which I know are really core to, the legal profession as a whole.
I practiced law for 10 years. I went to consulting for 6 years. I came back trying to transform lawyer development, and I started teaching at the law school now 10 and a half years ago. My courses focus on leadership, innovation, human-centered design, and increasingly adaptive leadership, change leadership. And they run together in really interesting ways. I teach both for executives within our Harvard Law School executive education program, business school style leadership programs for law firm leaders, general counsel, lawyers all over the world. And then I'm teaching classes for our law students too. In my law student offering, I get students interested in the first year. I've got a class in our short January term for 3 weeks on leadership fundamentals. And I start to plant some seeds about different leadership frameworks and get them interested. In the fall semester, I'm typically teaching a leadership course based on human-centered design. Students are put in teams. They have to solve a design challenge for an actual client, like the Justice Department Access to Justice Office, or a really interesting client like that, and give a professional pitch at the end of the semester with their design solution for their client. So it's almost like a clinic. Human-centered design, I think, is really critical for students to learn in this current moment as we're looking at generative AI and its ability to help the legal profession. What we need, I believe, to double down on are those human-centered skills, empathy, listening, curiosity, the type of thing designers do to solve problems in a human way are really, really critical skills. And I'm teaching them how to work in teams and collaborate as well. Most law schools allow you to get through 3 years of law school without ever having been in an actual team. So we're focused on that really intently. 6 years ago, I started working with Kennedy School faculty here at Harvard, because their leadership model of adaptive leadership, I think, is really well suited to the legal profession. It's about how you move people and organizations through change in a sustainable way, and how most of the time when leadership change efforts fail, it's because people didn't really understand at a human level what was happening in the system. And they tried to impose some kind of a quick technical fix that would get it done. Here's a new policy. Here's our new procedure. Here's our new technology. And it turns out no one follows the policy. No one read it. And no one uses the new tech tool that you gave them. You didn't move the people through change in an effective way.
I think in the law firm context, the issuing of the memo,
Yes.
dating myself by calling it a memo, I realize.
Yeah.
The issuing of the memo, check the box, the task is done. That's the work product.
And I work a lot on diversity, equity, inclusion issues, for example. And the law firm thinks, oh, we set up a mentoring program for diverse associates, so we're done. The problem solved. Like, no, that's not unhelpful. But that kind of technical fix doesn't get underneath what the adaptive leadership model talks about is changing people's hearts, minds, loyalties, deeply held ways of working, convincing them that not everything is changing about the DNA of the organization, but because the world is changing around us, climate is changing, but literally and figuratively, we have to figure out how to adapt to that. And it couldn't be more critical. And I think preparing our students for a world that's going to be much more fluid and changing than the world that lawyers from my generation faced is super important. And if we're not doing that, we're not doing our jobs here.
Scott, I've heard you say something before that I want to ask you about that I struggle with. I just don't understand how it fits the DNA of the space. We are the least self-reflective of professions. And it's not so much that I doubt it, is that I don't understand it, because how many lawyers are coming from philosophy backgrounds, political science backgrounds, English majors? We're thinkers, right? We're thinkers to the point of inactivity sometimes. How are we the least self-reflective of professions? Where does that come from?
That's a great question, Hal. Here's my thought. I mean, we train people in law school, and then when they move into typically the law firm world for our graduates, to orient themselves to put the client first always. And so every day when you're coming into work or you're staying at home and working from home, your focus is, how do I help the client? How do I help the client? That's part one of the issue. Part two of the issue is that when we do psychological assessments of lawyers and law students who come to our programs, and we've done this now for thousands of lawyers, we give them an assessment that measures their motivational needs. And by far, lawyers are motivated by a need for achievement. Underneath the need for achievement, this is based on a Harvard psychologist named David McClelland, is this idea that I'm competitive, I want autonomy, I want a challenging task, I want feedback, I want to get involved. And it's a highly task-driven need. I want to really do well and crush this task, and I'm going to move from task to task to task. There's no time for reflection necessarily built in. I'm immediately on to the next thing. When you think about how, if you're a lawyer in a law firm, you close this deal, you're immediately on to the next one. You won this motion at trial, you're right on to the next thing. And there's not those reflective moments. Layer on the economic model of law firms and even in-house departments, the understaffing of legal departments. People are so busy that there's almost never time to be able to step back. And when I talk about self-reflection, I'm talking about the kind of moments that are focused on, where am I in this system? What are the forces that are impacting me? What do I actually want? Not what the client needs, but what do I actually want? Can I ask those questions? And what has meaning and purpose for me? What's really evident, for example, is you go to Harvard Business School, you walk around the campus, and you can find in writing on buildings and all over the place what the mission of Harvard Business School is. They talk about it all the time. Every time the faculty at Harvard Business School have a big decision to make, they go back to the mission and they compare, the options to the mission and make a decision. Harvard Law School does not have a mission statement. Very few of the top law firms in the world have mission statements. If they do, I've done research on this on their websites. Typically, the marketing department wrote them. No lawyer has ever read them, and they don't even think about it. We don't step back and reflect, why am I here? What is my purpose? We kind of assume all of these things, economic impact for clients, but we don't talk about it. We don't reflect on it. And because of that, we don't reflect upon how can we take care of ourselves better in order to achieve the client's goals more effectively? How do I align my sense of meaning and purpose more effectively with how I'm interacting and as a lawyer and with my clients? There's just a huge, huge gap there that I think causes a lot of the issues we're seeing. In 2 weeks, we're hosting a 2-day summit here at Harvard Law School on lawyer well-being, trying to bring together in-house lawyers and law firm leaders to have conversations about how do we create a more sustainable profession. And I think one of those things is encouraging time when people can actually reflect and be unplugged, and having a model where we're acting with more intentionality.
What are some of the factors that are standing in the way of that kind of reflection and of progress in general with innovation, with sustainability? Is it any show of weakness is a problem? Is it the conservatism, the risk aversion that's sort of built into the training? Why can't we have these conversations more flexibly?
Inertia sets in without a doubt. And then the economic models, at least within private law firms, have been very successful. So it's hard to tell a room full of multimillionaires that like they're wrong becomes difficult.
People do that in tech all the time. I'm shocked by this.
Yeah, they probably do. But with lawyers, I think, again, we get focused back on the work. We want to get right back to the build hour. If it can't be billed to a client, it's not seen as productive or valuable time, which is really not true, of course. And when you look at the way a consulting firm works, the top consulting firms value bill, they don't bill by the hour. And so they invest a lot more time in those reflection moments and in those creation of, better structures for well-being, better structures for mental health, better structures for inclusion than law firms have been able to achieve.
I have to jump in here. I'm incredibly comfortable blaming any ill of this profession or any other on the billable hour. That is my natural culprit. I'm so happy to do that. But that always triggers the next immediate question, which is, when is the billable hour going to wither and die? I literally remember being on a panel at a legal conference 24 years ago. I remembered the year because it was the year 2000, so it was easy to remember. And the woman next to me, who was very experienced in the space, had been there for me. Within 5 years, the billable hour will be gone. 24 years ago. I mean, what does it take to make that change happen?
One possible scenario that we're looking at now is with generative AI being able to disrupt how a lot of junior level work gets done at law firms, taking a lot less time and fewer associates. The law firm's current approach to overbilling for junior time and underbilling for senior time and balancing it out somewhere in the middle has to change. And I think that unless they are comfortable saying our partner rates are now $15,000 an hour, they are way underbilling for their top time and way overbilling for junior time. If that junior time is dramatically reduced, for them to maintain profitability where they want it to be, they'll either have to switch conversations to value billing and find new ways to do that. I think there are now data models and predictive analytics that can help them be more comfortable with bearing risk about whether they underprice something. I think that was traditionally a huge barrier. They didn't want to take that risk. So hourly billing at least is predictable for them and for the client. I think that clients are more interested in leveraging technology to drive both predictability of legal costs, but also to drive costs down. I think there's going to be some really interesting discussions, but this could be the thing that finally does it. But I'm with you. We've been talking about this for a very, very long time, and it's surprisingly tough. I think in part too, there's a confidence issue, and it's easier for lawyers to focus on the input and just tell you how much time I put into this than try to step back and describe how much value I added to that transaction or that deal. I did a study years ago within a firm, the 20 partners who had the highest realization rates at the firm across all these practices. The one common factor is that those partners were able to flip the conversation, Don Draper style, change the conversation. When you move from the client is challenging the bill, did it really take this lawyer X number of hours to do this task, or this group of lawyers this task? changing the conversation from the input to the output and reminding the client that, wait a minute, we were able to close this deal 2 weeks earlier. We got all of these terms that were not market standard. We had a great negotiation where we set the company up for a long-term, healthy relationship with the other side. You know, what are the ways that you added value to the transaction? I knew one partner who kept a running list on his desk on an old-fashioned legal-sized yellow pad, like during a deal. Here's the things that we did to add value. And if the client questioned it, he just pulled up that list and he had that description. We haven't trained our lawyers, especially younger partners. I think younger partners are terrified when clients push back on bills and they give in too easily. They typically have lower realization rates. And internally, they don't think that they're worth it and they're not seeing the value they've added. We're fish in water. And the old riddle is, who discovered water? I don't know, but it wasn't a fish. We can't see it, and they're not actually aware of the value that they're creating, and they're not able to charge for it. It's funny because the bankers, the consultants are very happily, aggressively charging for the value they add, and I would say overcharging in some ways, but they never feel guilty about it. Lawyers feel guilty about it, which is crazy.
I could not agree more. And I think that that's a reflection of that thinker mindset, conservative sort of mindset, risk aversion mindset versus the go out there and make as much money as you can. It's a very different mindset in financial services. And with the lack of mentorship, I think we've seen a lot of improvement of that over the last couple of decades. But the lack of mentorship, from people can't see your reaction here, but you're questioning what I just said. And
I'm not so sure. I mean, again, I'm trying to paint, I tend towards more of the apocalyptic when I think about the broader implications of AI, I will admit. But when I am trying as an optimistic person to find sources of hope, one idea is that, look, if it's going to take the junior associate a third of the time to complete their task because they get to work together with a really helpful generative AI tool to write the first draft of the memo and come up with research that's helpful much quicker, does that free up their time so that they can be shadowing the partner in the meeting, on the phone call? The old idea that the client wouldn't pay for that or there's not time to do that. Associates tell me they get very little shadow time like that. Lawyers of the future are going to have to be adding value through their human capacities and judgment, to the intersection of empathy, listening, curiosity, integrative problem solving, creativity, design type solutioning, applying business skills to the legal framework within the deal. That's where the value add is going to be when the technical practice of law is mostly owned by generative AI. So does that free up the time for more mentoring and coaching? Is a hopeful way to look at it. It could be really interesting. Maybe we're back to the old, it's closer to a one-on-one or one-on-two apprenticeship model, but the apprentice actually gets to spend time listening, learning, discussing, because the AI tools are making the drudge work and the grind it out stuff a lot easier.
So merging these two conversations, do you think there's a potential for a positive impact on the further adoption of AI on some of the issues around lawyer well-being that we were talking about earlier?
I'm hopeful about that. I think if the grind it out kind of junior work is a lot easier to do, that definitely, and people are working at a higher and best use of their intellect, that definitely has profound mental health impacts. So that does matter. I worry that the culture of firms, again, as an adaptive challenge, the hearts, minds, loyalties, deeply held values, ways of working, habits are very ingrained. And would it just be a different version of we're still available 24/7? We're just doing different things is something that I worry about. And because to me, the driver of lawyer well-being has to be the ability to unplug, the ability to have some predictable time for yourself. That when neuroscientists, studies that the factors that cause anxiety and mental health issues, a lot of them are related to this. I don't have control over parameters around me. I don't find meaning and purpose in what I'm doing. How we can, as a profession, challenge some of the underlying assumptions, I think is really critical. Whatever the business model turns out to be, we've got to have the courage to step back and challenge some of those fundamental assumptions, or in whatever business model is there, we're still going to be in trouble.
Well, so much of your work and teaching is around helping organizations, law firms, and legal departments alike with their organizational mindsets and structures and ways to enable this kind of innovation and adoption. And what advice do you have for folks listening in these leadership positions who might want to gear their organizations more towards being able to have these adaptive capabilities?
Yeah, adaptive capabilities are formed in a number of ways. One is, can you adopt more of a learning, piloting, experimentation mindset? Be curious and willing to take chances, pilot things, try, learn, and move forward. So, a more innovative culture is really critical to try to create. Another aspect of it is, do you have an organization and the adaptive framework that will say is a strong holding environment for hard conversations to happen? So for people to challenge basic assumptions and to have the courage to speak up about the elephants in the room that no one wants to talk about. When we see law firms implode with a run on the bank kind of collapse, the way we've seen law firms, over the course of our careers, where we've all seen that happen, it's because the leadership and the partnership did not have the ability to have tough conversations, challenge each other, grow and learn together. And there's no doubt that the best legal organizations are going to be the ones that figure that out well and have a robust kind of culture of that piloting, experimenting, learning. The idea that you have to be setting a sense of meaning and purpose, I think, is also really critical. Younger lawyers are now asking for it more explicitly. And there's a narrative out there that, well, this generation, they want all this high level meaning and purpose stuff. It didn't matter to us. I don't believe that. I have a former student, graduated several years ago, went to a startup company, ended up now he went to McKinsey for 4 years, and then went to a family business. On his last day at McKinsey, he sends me an email saying, "Professor, it's my last day at McKinsey. I had a great experience here. I know you were at the firm years ago. I thought you might want to read this." So I click on his little blog post about his time at McKinsey, and it's saying wonderful things about the learning and the network and everything he built there. And then there was this sentence, and it says, "Unlike people from older generations, I really want to find meaning and purpose in my work." And it just floored me. I called him and I said, "That's not true. We're terrible at articulating it. And as I said before, in the law, especially, we put the client first. We're in noble, humble service of our client. We're not used to talking about why we're there. And we don't talk about it at the organizational level. We don't talk about it at the team level. In the business world, consulting world, the military, every time you launch a project, the team gets together and it talks about, why does this work matter? What's the purpose of it? What's the context in which we're doing it? And lawyers never do that. In 10 years of practicing law, I never once had a launch meeting for a project where a partner talked about why the work mattered and why we were doing it. It's just all kind of assumed. He just moved task to task, and it has profound mental health implications for that. And I think we lose people from the profession just overall as a result of that neglect. Partners are also at the individual level really afraid of being vulnerable or opening up, or maybe they just don't focus on it. Maybe it's not fear, but as an example, a lot of older partners will complain to me, this generation they don't want to be me. And they already know they don't want to be a partner. I'm like, well, you're a salesperson with your clients. When was the last time you talked to an associate about why you love your job? When was the last time you told them why it's good to be you? And in 10 years again of practice, never did I have a partner talk to me about why they got into law, why they loved it, what they loved about being a partner. I'm supposed to just assume that. And those stories can be incredibly powerful. And when I've done workshops with law firm partners around issues like that, it's been really interesting to see. I put them through a workshop on public narrative, a storytelling leadership practice developed at our Kennedy School by Marshall Gans, a famous civil rights organizer. And when they go through that workshop and they're able to do a 2-minute discussion about what was it that got them into law, what do they love about it, they're really powerful. And I think for us to sustain the legal profession with the best talent, we've got to circle back to that too. And I do think that the best legal organizations, the most adaptive, the ones who are going to thrive, and as the world is changing around us, they'll have an understanding of their deeper sense of meaning and purpose.
I think internally, I totally agree. I think we're so much the same. The environment, the expectations, what you were allowed to talk about, what you were allowed to address, so different. When I was in practice, there were questions I was terrified to ask anyone that would know the answer to, because of course I'm supposed to know this. The imposter syndrome-ness was overwhelming within that environment. Any show of weakness, any show of a lack of perfect productivity at all times, any down minute. And sure enough, yeah, I very much saw that experience of being concerned about billing for the value you're bringing.
Right. And the guilt you feel every day if you didn't quite bill enough, that weight on your shoulders. Although you did other things that were very helpful. I led recruiting in my office and ran the summer associate program. And I was really good at it. But there was no doubt that every day when I, spent 4 hours doing that because I had to and I couldn't bill it, I wasn't getting credit for it, I was feeling terrible. And that was very challenging. The other thing that I think is interesting is on campuses here, especially, we've had all these big debates about whether ESG is real and sustainability conversations. And there's the big debate about whether the grand pronouncements that companies are making on ESG mean anything when corporate law requires them to maximize profits for shareholders. There's all of that debate. Why does the corporation exist? Whether we should change laws and regulations or whether we can rely on corporations' goodwill when they're talking about ESG and sustainability and stakeholder capitalism. Law firms are private organizations and they can do whatever they want and they can exist for whatever purpose they want. It doesn't have to be maximizing profits per partner. And yet it becomes sort of the default share price of a law firm. And when we see firms opting more towards short-termism than long-termism, I get really concerned, especially now when we're talking about investments in learning, creating a learning organization, reflection time. How are we going to work together with generative AI and in the tech world to make the practice of law, more efficient and better? We don't have that built into our model because of that kind of lack of long-termism and the idea that we can think about why do we exist as a law firm and what are we trying to achieve? I think it could be really interesting to have a kind of a law firm that would have a different, more stakeholder driven model. I think it'd be super attractive for talent and clients, for example.
Well, I mean, it's not all hunky dory for my generation of lawyers and this younger generation of lawyers, especially when you look at some of the potential impacts of generative AI and potentialities that law firms might need less first year associates down the line. And what does that mean for this entire system built up around law schools and law firms and that pipeline and student debt, et cetera? And so, do you think legal is ready for generative AI and some of its impacts?
I think, again, it's a really complex question because there are parts of the legal profession that are very quickly adapting, learning, diving into it with great enthusiasm, seeing its potential, not only in the corporate practice of law, but also for the people in our society who traditionally have not had good access to legal advice and legal tools. The potential for generative AI to create more equity and justice is really tremendous. So there's all sorts of hope that way. Then there's the whole bunch of legal organizations in-house and within law firms where people are just focused on moving from task to task, getting the work done, keeping their heads down and hoping that they can just get to some element of maintaining the status quo until they retire. And, and I think that's a dangerous thing. You've got younger lawyers who are both terrified, but also excited in a combination. And they're looking for clues from leaders, but the leaders don't know what clues to give typically because they're both nervous about it and uncertain.
If I could, in those, because you educate so many young students now that are going into the profession with hopefully a little different mindset, are you seeing a sort of combination? And actually, I'm looking at one of the people across the room right now that had this mindset years ago, that are combining the legal education and the entrepreneurialism and the advent, the opportunity that AI affords to change models, to transform things. Are you seeing that spirit of there's a different way to do this? There's a different kind of law firm model that could finally take root and really upend the system a bit?
Yeah, I think there is that kind of energy and curiosity about it. We have an organization here called the Harvard Law Entrepreneurship Project, and it was formed 25, 30 years ago with the idea that law students could give business school students who had business advice some kind of legal advice and help entrepreneurs with legal advice and be coached by practicing lawyers about how do you give legal advice to an emerging business idea, emerging company. Now, what I'm seeing is our students like Meme want to be the entrepreneurs. They don't want to be giving advice to the entrepreneurs. And there's a lot more of that happening. And Meme and Jerry are teaching a great course on legal entrepreneurism now. And I know it's always oversubscribed and students get really excited about it. There is different energy. I think that it's challenging because we still have as part of what we do is to teach legal frameworks from very traditional sources, case law and traditional legal tools, oral advocacy, written advocacy. It is important that law schools step back and figure out, wait a minute, what of this is retained and what of it do we need to alter, modify as the world changes around us? 10 years from now, do we need to teach legal writing? Even 5 years from now, I'm not sure. Because if generative AI is generating, a 90% accurate, good first draft of the memo, are we teaching them prompt engineering plus some editing skills in a different way? Do I ever craft another legal memo from scratch? I'm not sure that's going to be done. And when I was growing up, my dad, as a nuclear engineer, had this big office desk in his study. And my brothers and I would go in, and there was this thing on his desk we used to play with because it slid back and forth. And it was kind of a fun plastic tool. And it was called a slide rule. And I ask my students now, have you ever heard of a slide rule? Only about 5% have even heard of one.
And they just saw it in Apollo 13 being used.
Yeah, something like that, right? And even then, that movie's old. So now he mentioned that movie, and I haven't seen it. So
I realized as soon as I said it, this isn't helping, is it?
I stay away from cultural references in all the classes I teach because I'm never, ever accurate. And Taylor Swift is the only reliable source and, as of right now.
Yeah, no slide rules in the Barbie movie, not at all.
Yeah, when the Texas Instrument calculator came out that was able to do the scientific algorithm calculations really easily, engineers at the time were saying, well, they still need to learn how to use the protractor and the slide rule and da-da-da-da-da-da. But no one does that anymore. You don't need to do it. So I'm wondering what will be the slide rules of traditional legal education and the traditional training of lawyers that we just move on from. And again, if I were doubling down as a law student now, I would be looking at the human skills, building out my negotiation, empathy, listening, design, creative skills, team skills, and my business knowledge, finance, valuation, accounting, strategy, business skills. So I understand what the client is actually trying to achieve at a better level than AI would. And I can be integrating that and prompt engineering and understanding how to work with tech and building out use cases, studying all of them. That's where value is going to be added.
Yeah, but that triggers for me, looking back at the narrow prism of contracts, all the language that is generated, that is created, that you're questioning whether we even need to keep teaching as pertains to contracts, at least, and certainly pleadings and other use cases as well. But it's an encapsulation or a representation of the underlying data point, right? It's a way of conveying, this is how things will go in this particular scenario. Here are the liabilities, here are the obligations, here's how it plays out. The language is secondary. The language is there to convey what is meant to happen. If there is a more direct way to relay what is meant to happen as data points, as if-thens, then arguably the language matters less. So I find it ironic that we're at a point now where we're at a crossroads because we've taught the tech to mimic human language very effectively, whereas the human language was all about getting to the structured data points. So is there a future where really it's all about the structured data points and gradually the human language starts to wane in significance?
No, it's a really interesting concept because the learning that junior associates, again, going back to it, does create more time for them to have discussions with back to the apprenticeship model, where the structure is explained to them and the overall concepts are explained to them and they see what is happening in the deal rather than just editing this document for signature pages and all the other, the stuff that I did as a junior associate. I look back and it's like, oh my God, it was incredibly mindless. And there should have been a tech tool that just did it for me. And then I could have been talking to the partner about tell me about this client and what their business goals are. I don't remember having those conversations, and I would have learned so much more and seen the contract as the vehicle for that rather than, a technical thing I just had to work on and grind out and had to make sure there were no typos in it. So I think you're right that it gets to that higher level more effectively. And then it generates creative possibilities. So, here's one structure. What if we thought about it differently? I think there's a lot of interesting ways that more value can be created by lawyers when they get out of those, spending so much of their time just in those little tiny details in the language, as you said.
When we have these interviews, we like to take one moment and just ask a single kind of fill in the blank where you take a phrase and finish off the sentence. And for you, based off today, I'd love to just say it as the legal profession's attitude toward generative AI is blank, and would love to have you fill that out if you could.
Complex is the best word I can come up with right now because there's so many different layers of engagement and excitement and also terror and fear and apathy. There's, and willful ignorance. And I think I'd like to be able to focus more on the positive applications of this for the world, for equity, for justice, and am hopeful that we'll be able as a profession to build some more of the adaptive capabilities we need to move our profession forward through this change. The disruption as it comes is going to be profound, but there are ways to deal with disruption and change that are more productive.
Yeah, I'd say complex also because legal's not just looking to adopt these tools, but in the in-house context, they're also writing policies about how the entire company adopts these kinds of tools from a policy and risk perspective. So,
or often doesn't. The policies are often about don't, no code in ChatGPT.
Legal reasoning, ethics, and a sense of commitment to our higher purpose as lawyers. I always say legal profession. You'll never hear me say legal industry. There's an industry within a profession. The profession has a higher calling, and we're given special status before the law. And as members of the bar, we have to figure out the regulatory structures, the guardrails, the way that we can help societies take this incredible tool and technology and use it for good. And that's another area I'm talking to my students about. If I were a young student right now, I would be learning all I could about both how it works, but also trying to find ethical, moral principles, guidelines, analogies to say, this is the direction we need to head in terms of leveraging the technology for good in the world, but protecting the world from its other possible uses and its ability to destroy institutions. It was much easier when I was growing up as a kid and then early days as a lawyer. The big thing on the table was in the Cold War. My dad was a nuclear submarine captain in the Cold War. He had a button to push, to launch nuclear missiles. And
was it really just one button? I always thought there were like keys and all sorts of things.
There's a button and there's a key and other stuff. But
okay, that gives me a little more confidence.
Pretty darn easy to do if you wanted to do it. But the nuclear power and nuclear weapons were all sort of and still continue to be managed by nation state entities and treaties, global treaties. And some of that is falling apart right now, which is also scary. But for at least the last couple of decades since the end of the Cold War, we really haven't worried about it. Mutual assured destruction and all the things that I was terrified of as a kid and heard about. The generative AI, of course, is not being developed by government entities. And it's a lot harder to put your finger on where you might start controlling things when you've got both state actors and non-state actors and corporations and a corporate legal structure, which requires the maximization of profit for shareholders as the only goal of the corporation. Then you can say all you want about our mission and our commitment to sustainability, stakeholder capitalism impacts, positive impacts in the world as a generative AI company. But at the end of the day, you're responsible just to the shareholders. And lawyers are going to need to be in the middle of figuring out what kind of legal constructs, regulation, guardrails can we put around this, and how do we point this towards good rather than destructive capabilities. We train lawyers to be skeptical and cynical and with a negative orientation towards the world and problems because we're highly paid for that. If I'm doing a deal, I've got to predict all the things that can go wrong and build in protections for my client. If I'm in litigation, I'm assuming the worst about what the other side is trying to do. But you spend 12, 14 hours a day doing that, it's hard for you to move into that positive generation of creative ideas space. What I worry about with our lawyers, right, is that we increasingly specialize and we never rest. And so it's exactly the opposite of what we need to generate creative ideas. We're putting our brains in a framework where we have a negative problem-solving orientation. We specialize and narrow the sets of data we're getting because we don't have time to do anything else. And then we're exhausted. Now, how are you supposed to come up with creative ideas that change the world then?
Before we let you go, Professor, I have one more question for you, which is there one piece of advice you could give to legal professionals after today's conversation and this kind of crossroads that we are at as an industry and profession?
Other than talk to Hal and Memme because it's so much fun.
Yeah, absolutely right. No, I keep coming back at the core of the courses I'm teaching on design and adaptive leadership, that the real core is empathy, listening, curiosity. And the more you're trying to move systems forward, you've got to approach people with that kind of curiosity. Why is the system the way it is? How do I listen and empathize? What are they struggling with? The more you reflect that back and you show them that you're listening and you understand, the more capacity you have both to understand what the real problem is, which is how human-centered design works. We think we know the problem. We start solving it before we've actually understood it and talk to the humans in the middle of it. But then as you're trying to move people through change in the adaptive framework, it's acknowledging that sense of loss, that they have to give up something, the fear that they have, and then you're able to help understand them and move people forward. So I strongly believe that the greatest skills that lawyers can be employing right now are those three.
Professor Scott Westfahl, always a pleasure. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. It's been an honor as always.
Meeting of the Minds, the Legal AI podcast, is brought to you by Evisort. To learn more about Evisort and how we can help you contract better with AI, visit Evisort, EVISORT.com.
You can find Meeting of the Minds on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you listen to podcasts. Don't forget to click subscribe so you won't miss future episodes.
On behalf of everyone here at Evisort, thanks for tuning in.